And I remember they called me. I was just in my apartment waiting for them to come home. And I just remember the guy called me and he's like, hey, there's been a car accident. There's one survivor. They're about 2 hours away from our house, and there was a dust storm that covered the highway, and it caused a 22 car pileup, and it killed 8 people total. And 5 of those people were my family. So my wife, Courtney, died. My son, Riggins, died. My daughter, Frankie, died. My brother, Race, died. My nephew, Ryder, died. And my son, Blue, was the survivor.
Oh, I appreciate you sharing that, Mason. I wasn't sure if you wanted to share it. Like I heard you on stage. This is why I wanted to help you spread the word and be on my stage here on the podcast.
I think my overarching theme is to talk about the hard stuff. It doesn't have to be death of a loved one. It could be your addiction. It could be that you're lying. It could be, or what? A divorce. It could be.
I'm Garrett Wong, and this is the Investing to Win podcast. How do you define success, and what does winning look like for you? Mason, welcome to my podcast.
Glad to be here, Garrett. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know that a lot of people might know what has happened to you back in 2021. I'd like to actually maybe allow you to just take a couple of minutes, maybe pre-2021. Tell the audience a little bit about yourself, where you're from, that type of thing.
Yeah, I grew up in Utah, West Jordan, Utah, right near Salt Lake. I was the youngest of 5 kids, and my first passion was basketball. And I just loved basketball. I'd shoot hoops every day in my driveway. And then in high school, I met this girl named Courtney, and we just hit it off, man. Like, I don't know what it was like for you, Garrett, in high school, dating or girlfriends, but I just had Courtney. And we were high school sweethearts. Our senior year, we got voted most likely to marry your high school sweetheart by all our classmates, which ended up happening. We ended up getting married. And Courtney, she was a nurse. She was captain of her volleyball team, basketball team. She was just someone people could trust and look up to. And Courtney was very honest and held herself accountable and didn't take herself too serious. She was just a great person in a lot of ways. So we get married, and then I came from a large family, and I don't know what it was, but I just always wanted to have kids and be a dad, and that was my biggest goal in life. And so I was playing college basketball in Southern Utah at the school called Utah Tech, and we had our first kid my senior year playing college basketball, Garrett, which is not a good idea. Being a college athlete and having a kid, like it was. And then Courtney, my wife, she was a nurse and she was working graveyards. So it was just, wasn't ideal, but wanted to have kids so bad. So we had our first kid, Riggins. I finished playing college basketball, and I actually get the head coaching job at my old high school to be the head basketball coach. So I take that job, and Courtney and I, we have 2 more kids. We have our second son, Blue, and then our daughter, Frankie, as I'm teaching and coaching high school kids. And then Courtney's a nurse. And I'm not like a business guy or like, that's all I wanted, Garrett, was just this family, and I had it. And then, I mean, that was my life for a couple of years. And then I get a phone call from this place back in Southern Utah where I played college basketball, and they wanted me to run their basketball operations for this. It was called Nets on Fire, and just this big basketball complex, and they wanted me to put together, AAU basketball teams and coach and train players and do it full time. And I'm like, what? This is like my dream job. Like, I'll just be a full-time basketball trainer. This is awesome. And Courtney loved the idea, so we moved back down to Southern Utah. And then shortly after that, my family had a family reunion, and I couldn't go because I just took this new job, Garrett. And so I felt like, I couldn't miss the first basketball tournament. Like, I literally just took the job. So I didn't go, but my wife took our kids, and my brother Race, who also lives in southern Utah, he's obviously going to the same family reunion. And so uh, Race decides to take his youngest son, Ryder, and travel with my family to the reunion, which was a great idea. They could travel together and be more fun for the cousins, and it was great. And then that Sunday coming back, um, there was a dust storm. They're about 2 hours away from our house, and there was a dust storm that covered the highway, and it caused a 22 car pileup, and it killed 8 people total. And 5 of those people were my family. So my wife Courtney died, my son Riggins died, my daughter Frankie died, my brother Race died, my nephew Ryder died, and my son Blue was the survivor. So he was the lone survivor of that accident. And I remember they called me. I was just in my apartment waiting for him to come home. And I just remember the guy called me and he's like, "Hey, there's been a car accident. There's one survivor." And I just remember hitting the floor, crying and screaming, and but also kind of out of my body. Like I remember there was a moment I remember like what thinking like what are these noises? Like these crazy noises. Like what is that? And then realizing like that's me. Like that's I'm making those noises. And it was very much in body, feeling all these different emotions, but then kind of out of body. Really hard to explain. But every once in a while, there's like this acceptance guy that would be like, "Hey, like we gotta keep going. Like we gotta figure out who the survivor is. We gotta get to the hot. Like we gotta tell people. You gotta pick up the phone." And so I remember picking up the phone, and my brother Ray's, he was a state championship wrestler. Man, he was just like tough as nails, and someone I always looked up to. And I was just so scared, Garrett, that my brother Race was going to be the survivor. So I do remember praying, like, please don't let it be Race, because then my whole family's dead, and like I don't know, I can't do that. And so when they told me it was my son Blue, it was like this combined feeling of relief that like one of my kids is alive, but then it was attached to this guilt and sadness that my brother's dead. Um, and grief. One thing that I've learned with grief is like the pain of that moment is still there. Like, and that's why talking about it is really hard because it takes you back to that moment. And um, the pain. I mean, it's been 3 years, and the pain is very much the same, if not worse. But I think by talking about it, and as time goes on, you get stronger to carry it. But it's still, I mean, it's brutal, man. Um, and so I still have that guilt and pain to this day. But talking about it has sure helped me. Um, but they tell me the survivor's a 3-year-old, and so they take him. They life flight him to a hospital in Salt Lake, and I have to get a ride from my friend. He drives me 4 hours, and my son Blue survived. He had a fractured hand and some deep cuts on his head, but we spent one night in the hospital, and then we left the next day, and that was so yeah, that was July 25th, 2021, and since then I've found podcasting and public speaking to honestly help me, Garrett. Like I just need to talk about it, but I've also found that I've been able to help a lot of people deal with their grief and trauma by just simply talking about it.
Oh, I appreciate you sharing that, Mason. I wasn't sure if you wanted to share it. Like I heard you on stage. This is why I wanted to help you spread the word and be on my stage here on the podcast. And it's just as painful listening to it the second time. And I don't know how you do it to relive it every single time you take a stage or talk about it on a podcast. Like you are one of the strongest people I've ever seen. Um, you know, maybe I mean it's so hard for me to try to do this interview. I knew it was going to be a really challenging interview. And I've interviewed a lot of people, but like the message of strength and resilience, like how do you find the strength to keep going every day? Maybe tell the audience about that.
Oh man, yeah. My son Blue for sure. Uh, yeah, because I was kind of stuck in this, and I talked about this a little bit at the JT Fox event, but it's very much like you're in this limbo of I I don't want to live. Like I want to die for lots of reasons. To see him again, so the pain would stop, so the guilt would stop. Um, and I kind of like I feel like I deserve death in a way because a father takes care of his family, takes care of his kids, and I didn't do that. So it just feels like something I deserve too. But I could never do that because of Blue. Like my son Blue's alive and I love him more than anything. And obviously, I mean, if you think of Blue, he's just lost his mom and his older sibling, his younger sibling, and I mean, so everything he's going through. I mean, there's no way I could leave him. So obviously, it was weird. It was very because I wouldn't even say I was close to ever killing myself. Like I don't think I was ever close because of Blue, but the thought of it just couldn't escape my mind. Like and just thinking of ways I could die guilt free without like being like tied to Blue. Like you can't blame me if I get cancer. Like I was just thinking of scenarios of how I get. But Blue kept me here, and then it's just so hard, Gary, because it's hard to balance. It's so hard, man. I know. Don't really know what I'm doing still, but it's hard. Like I want to balance my life with being happy and living the best life I can for them. Because absolutely, I know that's what my wife would want and my brother would want. But then at the same time, it just feels so wrong and disrespectful and not okay. And you kind of want to hurt and you want to be sad because that keeps you connected with them. So it's a really difficult balancing act to do. Because the guilt and shame is just it can swing both ways. Like, oh, you're just gonna lay in bed all day and feel and just hate your life. Like that's what you're gonna do with your life. Like they would want you to live and be happy. So then you do, and then you feel bad for that. Like, oh, you're happy? Like you're just happy. And so it's just like
It's a
I
roller
wanted to
coaster.
do, Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us about Blue. How old was he at the time of the tragedy?
So he was 4 days away from turning 4. So basically 4. Um, he's doing so good, man. He's doing great in school. He dirt bikes, he skateboards, he plays basketball, football. He's doing great. Um, I'm really impressed with his ability to like the sympathy and empathy he's able to have at such a young age. Really impresses me in his ability to understand when I'm really hurting and know if I need a hug or a snuggle. I think he's very aware of me and how much I'm hurting and wants to take care of me. And it's really cute, and he's my hero in the literal sense and the figurative I mean, he's my everything. But he's doing really good.
So in terms of, I mean, a 4-year-old, my goodness, I don't like I have 2 kids myself. They're older. I can't really comprehend the context of what a 4-year-old understands versus now he'd be. turning almost 7, or maybe he's already 7. Can you maybe tell us what those days were like?
Yeah. I mean, those early days are such a blur, and it's just hard for me to I just kinda remember bits and pieces of it. I do remember being told by my dad who's been in social work and therapy his whole life, and by my other therapists, they're like, "Hey, you do need to cry in front of Blue sometimes, like, not all the time, not every day, but he needs to know that it's totally appropriate and okay to be sad and to be heartbroken and to see you cry, like, that's normal and it's okay for him to see it." And so that was helpful, and I was also told, like, if Blue brings up the car accident, ask him follow-up questions, talk to him about it, but if he changes the subject or shuts down, then don't push it on him, like, just kinda let it go and just let him navigate that how he's comfortable with, which I think's been helpful. Now, one thing I've learned podcasting and just talking people weekly about grief is talking about them is so important, and not necessarily, like, talking about him in terms of everything will be okay, like they're in heaven and we'll see him again, but just talking about him in like, "Oh, like there's a PJ Masks backpack, Blue. Remember Reagan's PJ Masks backpack? And when I drop him off it," like just talking about him, I think helps so much. And it helps with the acceptance when we talk about them. Like, yeah, they lived, they died. These are things they did. So that's something that I take pride in is we have pictures up in our house everywhere of them. We talk about them. We have a podcast about them. So that's something I think's really helped him as well.
Speak to me about routines. I mean, were there any routines that you tried to kinda get in to just turn one day and into the other?
Yeah, very good question because routine is important with people. I think anyone in life, but people with trauma and grief, the routine goes away, which is understandable at first, maybe the first couple weeks or months, sure. But yeah, I didn't have a routine for so long, and I think that's what fed into the alcohol and drug use, trying to numb the pain and run from it, is I didn't have any direction at all. And it's hard, man. Grief and trauma is hard because a lot of people say, like, there's no right way to do it. You just handle it however, which is true. Like, in the loving sense, like, yeah, like, I agree with that. And I tell people that. But then, like, okay, like alcoholism and that there's stuff that isn't good though. But if we're just kind of like, oh, everyone handles it however, there's a lot of sad stories out there that don't make it on podcasts because they're just terrible. That it leads to homelessness, drug addiction, death, going to jail, whatever. Um, sorry, I forgot the original question. Oh,
No, just
the
routines.
daily routine.
Yeah.
The minute I got back to getting Blue to school every day, and then I took a job. I started cleaning pools. I'd take Blue to school. I'd clean pools till 3, and then I'd go pick Blue up. And I got paid $18 an hour to clean pools at 110 degrees outside. It's not a good job, but, like, I just needed a routine, and I needed some sense of accomplishment or purpose, like I'm doing something instead of just laying in bed. So and I guess what I'm trying to say is I love the question of routine because I think it's really, really important. I just it's something I still struggle with, honestly. Like, I don't have a daily routine, and that has a lot of problems in my day-to-day life, but I think I'm getting closer to a routine than ever before, which is good.
Well, I mean, and a large part of it, Blue is your routine, right? I mean, if you didn't have him as your guiding light, my goodness, right? I mean,
Sure, yeah.
yeah, different narrative. Mason, when did you first think of just telling the story and then the podcast? Maybe tell us a little bit about that.
So the 1 year mark was coming up. It was the 1 year anniversary of the car crash, and um, I just spent the whole year numbing the pain with alcohol and drugs mostly. Couldn't talk about them, and a lot of it I just don't remember. Um, and I also had so many people reach out to me, like people across the world, like who heard the story, like flooded with all of these messages, and I just didn't have the capacity to say anything back. Like I was just hurting. So I mean, grief makes you really selfish. You just think about your own pain all day. You don't really have a lot of time left over for other people. And so I do remember, like, I want to say thank you and show people like me and Blue are still somewhat okay and we're alive and like we're okay. And thank you for, I just want to say thank you and do something for Courtney Riggins, Frankie Race, and Ryder on the anniversary. So I decided to start a podcast, and I would upload the first episode on the anniversary date. And then I also set up a speaking event, and I just put it on my Instagram. I'm like, hey, I'm speaking at Utah Tech University, and it's free. If you want to come listen, you can. Thanks for everyone's love and support. And then a bunch of people showed up, and I spoke, and then people reached out to me to like, hey, will you come speak at this juvenile detention center? Will you come speak to our football team? Will you come speak at our hospital to our, I mean, I just started picking up these random speaking events, and I went from couldn't talk about it to now I'm like, where can I talk about it? I need to talk about it. And so I've kind of flipped. But yeah, that's kind of how the podcast and my public speaking journey began.
What's the podcast called?
Called the 1090 podcast. My dad sent me a quote after the accident, and the quote was, life's 10% what happens to you and 90% how you respond to it. And the email my dad sent me was something like, Mason, like, if there's a if there's anything we could do to change it or to get him back, we would. But like that's just not the reality. Like this happened, and all we have left to do is like, how are we gonna respond to this? Um, and he sent me that email when I was trying to come up with a name for my podcast. I'm starting this podcast. I'm like, I don't know about you, Gary, but it was hard for me to come up with a name. Like, what am I gonna call this podcast? And then my dad sent me that quote, and I'm like, man, like this is it. Like this is it. And so I wanted that to be the name of the podcast. So that's where the name came from.
No, it's obviously on Instagram. You've got a huge following now. Lots of speaking engagements. You know, you mentioned, and I read about community and community support. Were there any acts of kindness that really stood out to you from what you can even remember in those early days?
Oh man. I'm honestly like, there was so many that if I started listing some, I would just leave so many people out.
Yeah.
But like,
Well, in general, maybe, you know, I
yeah,
don't
I
want
mean,
you to name names. Yeah.
I remember the first month I was just staying at my parents, and like the house was just full of family, friends, cousins. They were just there for the first month. And there was candlelight vigils. We had a, a very powerful turnout to the funeral. And then, man, like the people who encouraged me to get into therapy, that helped me, man. Like I hated therapy at first, but I finally able to cry and then started to talk about it, and like that is when I kind of got my life back. Like before, I was just not dying for Blue, and then I started to like have this desire to actually keep living, and I think that was from the people that encouraged me to talk about it. Um, and then yeah, like my brother, I lived with my brother like the first year after. My in-laws were amazing, Courtney's family. I had so much help, dude, and honestly, Garrett, like that's a big part of my story is I have so much help. Like, there are so many people like me that didn't have my support route, and their story didn't turn out the same. It's not because they weren't I mean, like you said it at the beginning of the thing, Garrett, like, you're so brave and strong, and, like, that's just not how I see it at all. I just see it as this is life just happens to all of us, and we just have to take it the best we can, and I don't see really any other card for me to play other than talk about it and open up and try to help people with it. And
Yeah, no, for
yeah, I
sure.
just started rambling. I forgot your original question again.
You answered it a lot. You know what? Like I said, this is a little bit unconventional for me too, because normally I like have a business guest on, and my podcast started out as a real estate podcast on sort of how to, and then it morphed, as I'm sure your podcast is morphing a little bit into just origin stories, stories of strength, resilience. Maybe that's a business struggle. Obviously, you've got a tragedy and a personal struggle. And I wanted to, again, it's just giving you that stage. And there's something when you were on the stage with JT that spoke to me is just, you mentioned communication through grief. And now, I just wanted to ask you because I think it's evolved to more than that. I mean, you're talking about being an advocate for mental health and things like that. Can you maybe expand on that?
Oh man, yeah, I think there's so much power in grief. I think I'm gonna sound weird, like grief's just my thing now, but I think so many problems that we have individually, family, society stems from our ability to how we're handling our grief and our inability to talk about it.
Yeah.
I think causes so many issues with and that we don't even realize it. And I think if you can talk about the grief, it's gonna make there I love who I am now after losing my family. Like, I think I'm a better person in many ways. But that's because, like, I had to lean in and talk about it and completely feel the grief and take that on. If you just run from it, you don't get the good parts of it. Like, if you're gonna try to run from the pain or accountability or whatever it is, then you don't get the good part of the failure. Like, yeah, failure is the greatest lesson, like, we all know that, but we all run from it. Like, "Oh, I'm not accountable for that. That's not my fault." And when you do that, you miss out on the benefit of losing. You don't get the lesson. And that's what I've learned with grief is there's so much value from what I've lost. But again, if I run from the pain, I run from the gift of it. I run from the good parts of it. And that's something that I've taken to heart and it's really helped me and it's really helped other people too.
So is that your overarching message then? Is sort of, I mean, it's hard for me to say that. Obviously, I've had losses as well. I mean, everybody
Well,
listening
I
to this
I don't think I
podcast
don't
has,
think
right?
yeah, I think my overarching theme is to talk about the hard stuff. It doesn't have to be death of a loved one. It could be your addiction. It could be that you're lying. It could be or what
Loss
one
of a job, whatever it is.
job. Yeah, a divorce. It could be so many things. So many things. But yeah, I think talking about it and just accepting it. Accepting it. Like I don't relate with people who say it'll be okay one day. Like it's not if you can't say it in the moment, you can't say it a year later and think like, it's not okay what happened, and I don't think grief or trying to help people overcome grief or trauma, the goal shouldn't be to make them better because they're not gonna be better and they don't want to be better. That's not
Right.
what the goal is. The goal is to be heard and to be understood and to share it and then connect that pain with other people, and, yeah, I think it's so scary, the judgment's gonna come. Um, and that's another thing that keeps people from talking about stuff too is how they appear to other people.
Yeah, and to your point, Mason, I see this a lot. People are so worried about what other people think.
Yeah.
And they're also worried, and if I can kind of paraphrase your message, like it doesn't matter what you're suffering with, what your perception of that with, whether it's a death, a job, The point is that person is suffering and they're not talking about it. And it's very real to them, no matter how insignificant it might seem to friends and family. Would you agree with that?
That was exactly what I was trying to say, thank you. That was perfect. Yeah,
Yeah.
you should talk with me when I do public speaking.
Anytime, man, anytime. No, it's hard. And I think mental health, since we're kind of transitioning into that here, I don't pretend to have the answers. You go to doctors and they seem to want to just give you pills and stuff like that, which I know there's chemical reasons for having to do that, but I think everybody who's suffering from mental health are almost like ashamed of it, and your message of just talk about it, right? Just talk about it, grieve through it is healing in is of itself, and that's part of the process.
Yeah, I think, eh yeah, because you don't wanna be the weak link in like, you don't want people to worry about you. Like, cause that's another thing when the mental health thing and why people aren't talking is they don't want to be something that people have to worry about or and man, that's how I felt too. And, like, Garrett, think about what I lost, which is more than the average loss that someone might go through, and it's hard for me to talk about it. It was hard for me to ask for help. Like, the guy that should obviously be asking for help, it was hard. And so then what we do is I like to use the example of, like, if some guy gets his leg cut off and then he sees another guy get both legs cut off, he's like, "Well, I'm not gonna go to the hospital then or do anything because what should I complain about?" We do this comparison thing. Like, we compare our pain, and it prevents us from getting the healing that we need, and it's so ridiculous. Like, dude, your leg's cut off. You need to go to the hospital. You need to stop the bleeding. Like, you need to do stuff here. And so that's, like, a good visual example I use, but that's very much how I see it is the mental health. I think men, we don't wanna appear weak. We care what other people think, um, and there's a lot that goes into it. But Garrett, like, I don't know, like, you do business, your podcast. Like, isn't being honest, like, how does that work for you guys in the business field? Like, isn't that one of the best qualities and attributes you're looking for, or am I crazy or what?
No, in business, I think honesty and transparency is the number one thing that I look for, either in customers, entrepreneurs, future partners. But again, people don't want to appear weak, right? I think the best thing that I can do for my employees is be transparent and say sometimes, hey, I need help. I don't know what I'm doing. Maybe to friends and family, hey, I'm really stressed because of business. But to your point about the analogy with the single leg or double leg cut off, and how can I express this? You talk about deserving, right? I don't deserve to feel pain because Mason Sawyer has had his pain. And again, I'm paraphrasing you, but I mean, that is part of the message too. It doesn't matter what you're suffering from. You deserve to be heard. You deserve to have help. You deserve to have support and not go through it alone just because you think there are other people that are starving or suffering in the world.
Yeah, again, well said. Like, that is exactly yeah, what I'm trying to communicate and what I believe in wholeheartedly, and every message I get from someone and they're reaching out to be sincere, but they started off with, "I know my loss isn't as great as yours." Like, and I think they're just trying to be respectful, and I would probably do the same thing. So I get it. But, like, yeah, that's just kind of very much how we walk around with grief and trauma, and that world is very on eggshells, and it's because we never talk about it, so we really have no direction on how to handle it or what to do. And I remember I interviewed this guy named Colin Campbell who lost his 2 teenage kids to a drunk driver, and he said, "Mason, the number one thing people said to me was, 'There's no words. There's no words.'" And he's like, "That's the worst thing you can say to me because really what you're saying is you can't talk about it. You can't talk about it. It's so bad you can't even talk about it. There's no words to use." And Colin did a very good job. He wrote a book and he does a very good job explaining this, but he's like, that's there really are no words. It's really hard to explain the pain, but you need to attempt to try to talk about it, and that's why his book is titled Finding the Words, is it's this continual process to try to find these words that can describe this amount of pain, and you'll probably never find the words that can really sum it up, but the point is to try and talk about it. So, yeah, again, I just love that idea of opening up and talking, man, and completely, completely changed my life.
How many people, if you were to even estimate, I know it's almost impossible, do you feel that in the last couple of years you have helped through your messages?
Oh, man. I'd
I
like
mean,
to.
just people just reaching out is probably enough, right? To be able to tell their stories, but people that are listening to this podcast or your podcast and just making a difference. I mean, again, I applaud you for getting out there and spreading the message.
Yeah, I hope a lot, obviously, and I get messages daily. And listen, podcasting is free. Like, you don't, I mean, at least for me, I don't make, I mean, I lose money podcasting,
Me
honestly.
too.
That's, that's the real payment, are these messages of your like, I just lost my brother 6 months ago. Your podcast has really helped me. Or I get messages like that, weekly, sometimes daily if we post something. But yeah, man, that's what it's about, man, is if I can make a terrible thing, if I can make something good happen from something terrible, like, I think that's a good example that I'd want my son to see as he grows up.
And your family, right? I
Yeah.
mean, you talk about what they would have wanted you to do and be happy, but you're going beyond that, right? And really healing and spreading that message. Before we wrap up, because I know I want to be respectful of your time. What's I don't want to say what's next because you probably don't even know, but like personally, professionally, like as you're kind of going down this journey, have you thought about like is it speaking, just kind of doing this gig? Like what's next for Mason Sawyer?
Yeah, I want to, I got my bachelor's degree in psychology, so I wanna go back to school and get my master's in I wanna be a grief therapist, a grief counselor. So I wanna do a master's program, get my license, so that's kinda my long-term goal, but right now it's just being a father to Blue. Um, I'm dating again. I fell in love again with this girl named Sammy, so trying to show up for her, and then podcasting and public speaking. But yeah, I'm in January you can enroll, so I'm gonna go back to Utah Tech, where I played college basketball, and enroll and see if they'll accept me.
Yeah, no, that's a great plan. Fantastic. Um, I always ask, and I don't even know how the context is here, but I'm going to throw it out there anyways. So on my podcast, I ask every guest at the very end to define a question. I'm going to ask you because your answer could be completely different. But I always say this is the Investing to Win podcast. How do you define success and what does winning look like for you?
Wow. So, man, I if you would have asked me this before the accident when I was a high school basketball coach or like college athlete, I would have had something for you for sure. What is success? Um, Garrett, I don't know. So like with my podcast, my buddy, he uploads every episode. So I don't know how many people listen to our podcast. I don't know what our numbers are. Um, don't make money doing it. I think being in the moment, if you can be in the moment and be honest and you can you can love yourself, like you have positive self-talk and you have good relationships, I think that's success to me. Like and from the business part, I don't know, man. I don't look at
Well,
yeah, I
there
don't.
is no, that's the thing. Out of the hundreds of guests I've had here, nobody ever talks about money, right? it's very similar to what you're talking about because really winning for most people is about achieving a certain goal, lifestyle, being, like you said, being in the moment, and your perception, despite everything you've lost, is still very, 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 very real.
Yeah, I honestly think if I can be in the moment with my kid, because I just get the grief, man, will just take me to my past, and I'll just be daydreaming about the past I had with my little girl and my wife and my boy, and or you're just daydreaming of the future that we were supposed to have, and then you get caught up with the emotions and the anger and the sadness with those thoughts, and then it's taken me from what I had Bloom, a beautiful son. I actually have a wonderful life. I actually do. Amazing life. And I can't even appreciate the amazing life I had because of the grief sometimes. So I honestly think when I have successful days, it's when I'm able to be in the moment and balance my grief with my current living life with Blue and Sammy. But that's success to me.
Awesome. Well, that's a great place to stop. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing the message. Um, like I said, it wasn't any easier hearing it the second time. And yeah, I just thank you from the bottom of my heart and my listeners for coming on the pod.
Thanks, Garrett. I love talking about it whenever I can. So thank you very much.
All right. Take care.